whole room.
He's usually in this, like half.
Okay.
But is that the way you want it?
I don't know. Normally, EAPCE, how is it like?
A little bit. Yes, a little bit like this. You will have a speaker here,
I think so. Yes.
or you want it a little bit closer? Because here you can still not focus that much on the speaker.
Maybe a bit closer.
Like this?
Maybe see a bit of the participants as well. This too
Yes,
far, right?
Yeah. And more. Yeah, I think you can, like this you can see two here and the speaker.
Okay. So, how do you want the camera focus to be? Is it just only like the front here or the whole room?
What do you think is best?
In the past, by very long, Estella used to like only to focus on this
So
and the
you
speaker.
can- yeah.
But I don't know if you want to show like maybe two people or something, or you want to show the speaker and all. The recording, it doesn't matter. The recording, you can, it will pick up the speaker. No problem. But it's just the way you want a projector for people who don't.
Speaker is fine. Speaker is fine.
Okay, so good. Like this.
And he didn't bring his laptop or anything, so maybe I can help project. Or,
Yeah, you will have to.
Yeah, I already sent. Is this your laptop?
Yeah.
Did you get the slides then?
There are two connections the same, right?
Yeah.
Where do you stay?
Sedang buat.
Oh, Mount Kiara side. The Augustine. Hmm.
Make sure that when you speak, you are doing it from the room, not from the laptop, or you will do echo.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first iteration of the World Bank and Monash University Brombeck Seminar in Economics. We are very happy to have Rajesh Ramachandran today with us from Monash. So Rajesh is originally from India. He studied in Delhi, I think, at the Delhi School of Economics, if I'm not mistaken, and then pursued a PhD at Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. And before joining Monash fairly recently, he was a postdoctoral student in Germany, first at Heidelberg and then at Goethe University in Frankfurt. And Rajesh is going to talk today about schooling outcomes and untouchability.
Yeah, stunting outcomes.
Stunting and untouchability. Okay, so without much further ado, Rajesh, can we show the actual slides on the screen?
Super. Do you think I could just sit there so that I can just click through, because there's some I didn't realize that.
Oh, you can sit while you are.
Okay, super. Yeah. Hi. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for coming. I'm fortunate that Augustine, with whom I was trying to organize the seminar series, isn't here. We try to make it as region-specific as possible. Today we have to slightly fly about 4 hours away to India, unfortunately, and not remain in Southeast Asia. But I still hope that people find this topic interesting. This is joint work with Ashwini Deshpande, who's been a long-term collaborator, who's based in Delhi at Ashoka University. It's been a part of a longer project in terms somehow trying to understand gaps that are based on social identity, and in this context, in particular, trying to understand how early childhood outcomes are conditioned by certain kinds of social norms. So what's the motivation for thinking about stunting? When you look across the globe today, 1 in 4 children worldwide are classified as stunted, and this is from 2018. And what is stunting referred to is the impaired growth and development that children experience from poor nutrition, repeated infection, and inadequate psychosocial stimulation. To be much more specific, the WHO has the world height for age reference means drawn from 6 representative population, and any child who is 2 standard deviations below height for age is classified as being stunted. We care about stunting because we have a body of evidence, albeit from small samples, where people have been followed over long terms, and we have evidence that shows stunting, which is basically impaired growth before the age of child reaches the age of 5, has long-run consequences in terms of kind of occupational outcomes, cognition outcomes, educational performance, lost productivity. So in this context, given the role of stunting, in particular, why India is home to nearly 1/3 of all world's stunted children today. More importantly, this is not just a reflection of India's size, but also of the extremely high prevalence rate. So for instance, today, so this is the last round of data that's publicly available, that's the National Family Health Survey from 2015-16, 38.6% of Indian children under age 5 are classified as being stunted. So this, of course, implies, there's going to be serious implications for what's being termed as the demographic dividend that supposedly India could have, given more than 50% of the population is under 25 years of age. But we can see that, one of the big problems that India faces in this regard is child malnutrition, which is extremely prevalent. Just to put this in context, if you were to think about an economy like China, in comparison, the last round of data in China shows that the prevalence rate is about 4.8%. So, a magnitude of almost 9 times more in India. So India, in fact, stands as such an outlier that, the rates of stunting in India are even higher than in sub-Saharan Africa. This has been repeatedly been the principal focus of the literature in trying to understand how come stunting rates are higher in India than in sub-Saharan Africa, given that people think about the 2 key components in determining stunting rates are the amount of nutritional intake that you have and the kind of disease environment that the children face. And on both these regards, looking at various proxies in terms of thinking about access to nutrition, you can think about, what are the consumption bundles, and, data suggests that Indians have better consumption bundles in terms of value of consumption at least. And similarly, if you think about infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, they're lower in India as compared to sub-Saharan Africa, but the children are shorter in their height for age, okay? So, however, this immense focus on the India sub-Saharan Africa gap, which has been highlighted since the work of Deaton in the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences in 2007, and in 2017 a recent work by Seema Jayachandra and Rohini Pandey, again looking at this, has come at the cost of ignoring the inequities that kind of are present within India. So to just highlight the importance of being able to distinguish between different social groups, here you can see that, the top two panels on the left panel I'm showing you the height for age Z-scores, and on the right-hand panels, I'm showing you the stunting rates. So this is drawn from the Demographic and Health Surveys, 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and India shown in the red bar. You can see that the rates of stunting in sub-Saharan Africa are about 32%, and in India are about 39%, 38.6%, rounded off to 39 there. And that's been people have constantly tried to understand why is that Indian children are shorter than sub-Saharan African children. But in panel C and D, I break it up into by social groups in India, and I'm going to get to a clearer definition, but you can just see that, the two ends of the caste hierarchy, so these are the upper caste Hindus, so the traditionally socio-economically dominant group in the country, they do indeed have lower rates of stunting than sub-Saharan Africa. So on an average, 29% of the kids are stunted. But when you start looking at the groups which have been the traditionally socio-economically disadvantaged groups, and this is here the scheduled castes or the former untouchables, also known as the Dalits, the rates of stunting exceed by almost 15 percentage points. So almost 50% more likely to be stunted. So basically what I'm trying to show you here is that, the extent of gaps that exist within Indian society quite dwarf the gaps that when you think about comparing across India and sub-Saharan Africa. So what's our two key research questions that we are going to try and kind of address in this paper is, one, we want to kind of present to you a picture of the extent of caste disparities between the two ends of the caste hierarchy. So I'm going to be concentrating on the upper caste Hindus on one hand and the scheduled castes on the other. And I'm going to try and kind of provide you with...
Do you think you could move the whole thing a bit to the left? Because we have people here who are all blocking with their heads.
Can we show the slide on both screens? No? You cannot do that?
No.
Can you see? Is it that means the space in the Sub-Saharan
So the panel C is the most left-hand corner is sub-Saharan Africa, the blue bar, and the rest are the groups in India.
I see.
Now,
Yes.
Thank you, Edward.
is that yeah, and just to think that at any point of time, please feel free to just stop me, and any kind of questions are very, very welcome, so people don't have to wait. Yeah.
You have accounted for genetics.
So you are that's kind of a tricky question to answer, in the sense that, you mean to say between the India, sub-Saharan Africa differences?
Yeah.
So for instance, when you think about children who migrated from India, say for instance, to the United Kingdom, the earlier they migrate, the taller they become. In fact, the kids who migrate before the age of 1 to the United Kingdom, these are small samples, they show they get as tall as the British kids. So if genetics was what was underlying this, could not happen. A recent paper, the one I was citing by Jayachandra and Pandey, shows there are very strong birth order effects. The first child that's born in India, if it's a male child, the average height that the child reaches is as tall as a sub-Saharan African child. It's only as you go below the birth order, it's when these height effects creep in, which they strongly suggest that if genetics was to play, then you wouldn't see this kind of ordering happening, that the first kid it's the same mother, the first kid is as tall as the sub-Saharan African kid, and it's only the lower order kids because of systematic distortion of resources that's happening here. There the stories about boys versus girls and the preference for boys and how that's driving misallocation of resources. So there's been a lot of pushback in the literature that these differences can be attributed to genes. There might be a small component, but not certainly the extent of gaps that we're observing. And here, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be concentrating on comparing two social groups within India. Are there strict genetic differences between these groups? It's kind of hard to answer, yeah, but I'm going to not be looking at the role of genes in any way in my talk at all, yeah? Yeah.
You mentioned also the preference for boys over girls. The stunting vary in India between genders as well?
Very small differences. There are, but they are not so, they're not so stark as you might imagine. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so like I said, there are two key questions that we are interested in. I'm just going to provide you a very quick descriptive picture on kind of trying to highlight why these gaps are interesting to look at. And for the majority of the time, I'm going to try and focus on, can I pin down in some way, what is the role of caste-based discrimination in moderating these gaps? Yeah. Okay, so let me just start off by providing you kind of a description of gaps at the two ends of the caste spectrum. Just for a quick primer for people who are not so familiar with the Indian context, in theory, I divide the data into 5. For the purpose of the talk, I'm concentrating on what are the first two groups. Like I said, the upper caste Hindus are the traditionally socio-economic dominant group in the country. The second group, which are called the scheduled castes, they are called so because they were the group which were very ostracized, subject to the practice of untouchability. And when independence comes in 1950, they are put in a schedule of the constitution to be provided with affirmative action, and that's why they're called the scheduled castes. The scheduled tribes are the indigenous populations of India. Again, when independence comes about and the 1950 constitution is drafted, they are considered to be socially disadvantaged in a variety of ways. And again, they were also afforded affirmative action under the constitution. The other backward classes are this amalgam of groups which lie in the middle of the spectrum, constitute about 40% of the population or so. And finally are the upper caste Muslims. So these are Muslims who do not self-classify as being Dalits or scheduled castes. Okay, so just maybe maybe looking at this kind of brings home the point as to who are the former scheduled castes. So this is drawn from the Indian Constitution, and it shows you what are the selection criteria for being eligible for affirmative action. They cannot be served by clean Brahmins, cannot be served by the barbers, water carriers, tailors, pollutes a high caste Hindu by contact or proximity, is debarred from using public amenities such as roads, ferries, wells, will not be treated as an equal by the high caste men of the same educational background, is depressed on account of occupation. So basically, to bring home the point, severe social discrimination over and above, thinking about just differences in economic status. They of course go together, but the basis in the constitution is primarily drawn from these social forms of discrimination that were prevalent in India at that point of time. Okay, so like I said, how do the gaps look like? And I'm just going to provide you a very quick overview just to show you. So you can think about looking at the gaps globally. And on the left-hand panel, I'm plotting for you the height for age Z-scores. And on the right-hand panel, I'm plotting for you the stunting rates. The two key things that you can see is that the gap almost remains constant across the entire 60 months of data that you have for children here. And initially, stunting rates are not so high. They sharply increase by the time kids are 20 months of age and then kind of remains constant, okay? You can think about asking, how do they look like across different districts in the country? And I think that again highlights the extent of differences that you can observe here. You can see that in about 25% of the districts, the share of stunted children from the SC group is about greater than 50%. On the other hand, in only about 2% of the districts is the share of stunting greater than 50% for the upper caste Hindus. You can look at the reverse image. In only about 1% of the districts is the share of stunting less than 20% for the scheduled caste children, and for the upper caste Hindu children, this is about 17%. Okay. You can also think about looking at this spatially, and I'm plotting to you here the rates of stunting by districts in India, and you can see that it's the biggest burden of this of stunting, especially for the SCs, is concentrated in what's called the northern plains, or what's called the Bimaru, which translates basically meaning sick, and these are the states comprising of Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh, comprise more than 50% of the Indian population. And that's the belt where you can see, the map, that it's really a dark red for the scheduled caste children. In fact, in 84% of the districts in the Bimaru region, the rates of stunting exceed 50%. So really extremely high burdens. And again, the gaps are also most concentrated in these regions. Okay, so that's the kind of picture that you can globally think about seeing in terms of, how do the gaps look like in the context of India. So why do we think that, caste-based discrimination might have an important role to play? So I'm going to break this into two parts. Like I already said, any clarification, any doubts, please feel free to stop me and ask at that moment.
Question, right?
Yeah, of course.
Actually, if you go back to the previous slide,
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything specific about the district itself that has, based on the proportion of people, are there any correlation between the district that they go to and the caste that they're in?
Sorry, say it again.
Are there any correlations between the caste and the district that they're actually more concentrated in?
You mean to say are the districts in which there are heavy concentration of the groups, are they the ones where? No, that's not the case at all. Yeah. So you can see it's not, especially district is quite a large level in India. Yeah. And you will see that it's not that the SCs especially are kind of well represented across all parts of the country. So if you would zoom into a lower level of segregation, if you think about looking at village level data, so even in the same village, groups are going to be represented, but they're going to be living in different hamlets. So at a district level, you're not going to find very sharp variations in terms of thinking about what is the share of each group. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And migration is not a key thing, because if most of the population is centered there and life is really poor there, migration does not occur.
It does, but if you would compare India in a set of developing countries, you would see internal migration rates are very low, and it's always been a puzzle as to, why don't more people migrate so there is lots of seasonal migration, people from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh moving to the cities to work for a few weeks in a year and then moving back towards home. So there is migration, but still, like I said, the large majority of the population, so Bihar and Uttar Pradesh have populations of about slightly more than 200 million people each themselves. So they are really big states you're thinking about. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So like I said, in thinking about caste-based discrimination, I'm just going to provide you very quickly some kind of ethnographic evidence as to seeing why, it might have a role to play. Then I'm going to show you some correlational evidence on the link between untouchability practices and childhood stunting rates. And then hopefully in the last 15-20 minutes, I want to try and convince you that, this relationship, really there's something causal at play there, Okay, so, in theory, untouchability related practices were made illegal in 1950, but a huge body of evidence seems to suggest, and I'm going to show you some data also, that it remains extremely prevalent. So this is drawing from a UNHCR report. It suggests that residential segregation, violent hate and sexual crimes, denial of entry into temples, prohibition on intercaste marriages. So, even today, rates of intercaste marriages are lower than 5% in India. Forms of bonded labor, segregation in classrooms, discriminatory access to public resources remain widely prevalent. Directly related to the field of health, again, a lot of evidence to suggest, discrimination has an important role to play. For instance, this is a study by Shah and co-authors across 8 big states in India, and they document, in more than a third of the villages, Dalits were denied entry into private health clinics or centers. If admitted, they were treated discriminatorily. Public workers refused to visit Dalit villages. Similarly, work from Acharya in 2002 again documents, that children report experiencing caste discrimination in receiving medicines in the context of conduct of pathological texts, that auxiliary nurse midwives, which are the lowest level of service delivery, often refuse to enter hamlets where Dalits live because of the stigma of untouchability. Public health workers refuse to touch children while dispensing medicine, evidence that vaccination rates for this group lag behind because of, again, untouchability related concerns that are prevalent. Okay. Besides this kind of ethnographic evidence, you can also find this pattern in nationally representative data. So the Indian Human Development Survey has 2 waves, a nationally representative data set. In the wave carried out in 2011 and 12, households were asked, does any member engage in any kind of untouchability related practices? And then consequently, they were asked, if yes, also do they practice, that people are not allowed to enter the kitchen or they wouldn't share their utensils from people with certain groups, and people were asked to self-report. And at the same time, also members of SC households were asked if they experience untouchability. So you would think that, given that it's a kind of a sensitive question, which is in some sense illegal to practice, people might be hesitant to report this, but you see extremely high prevalence of self-reported practice of untouchability. So in the Bimaru states, which are really concentrated on the top right-hand corner, in states such as Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, almost greater than 50% of the population households self-report, that they do practice untouchability. And this graph also shows you that, it's just not that people's practices are kind of confined to a very private sphere, that it does not impact others, because you see the strong positive correlation that the areas where people report practicing untouchability are the same areas where more households who are subject to the practice of untouchability also report an experience of untouchability. Okay. So again, this is just to say that, been made illegal since 1947, but not only ethnographic and sociological evidence, but even, nationally representative household data sets seem to suggest the ubiquity of this practice in some sense. Okay.
So making it illegal is one thing, but was there a conscious effort by governments? For example, in the US, we see that there were many government programs and efforts to assimilate and to use it as education in the country.
No, I would say there have been. So the one form of action that the government has taken has been this form of affirmative action, which is quite extensive in terms of thinking about representation in higher education and government jobs. But of course, to attain both of them, you need to have finished a minimum level of schooling. So it kicks in at a much later stage. There's political representation also, but again, so you do have seats reserved for members from the SC group, both at village level and also at the central level. So again, but in terms of thinking about engineering social change through, say, civic education has been extremely lacking. There has been no deep engagement in school curriculums of any way of thinking about the history and then combating it. It's been relegated as if it was an artifact of the past. And what I want to try to argue is that maybe it's more than an artifact of the past. That seems to be a constantly living system even today. Yeah.
Rajesh, the data is almost showing higher levels of education having lower levels of discrimination. That be correct? Or
sorry again?
The data that you present here.
This is just on the prevalence and experience of untouchability that I present.
The states of Kerala and West Bengal are usually seen as having higher levels of education.
Yeah, so here that would be true here. I'm only going to be looking at child anthropometric outcomes and not on educational outcomes, but there is a strong correlation. Yeah.
Women education particularly.
Exactly. So you would see that, so the Bimaru states in general are lagging behind on a variety of respects, especially when it comes to human capital or human development indicators in any way. Yeah. So there's a strong pattern in the data. That's true. But hopefully now I'll show you with my identification strategy how I'm going to try and kind of tackle that problem, and then you will tell me whether you find it convincing or not. So like I said, so as a first step, what do? We have this data on untouchability, and we have data on child height from the National Family Health Survey. So I merge the data together. I calculate the state level averages of the proportion of households practicing untouchability, and then partition the sample by quintiles. When you do so, you see a very interesting pattern here. So again, on the left-hand panel, I'm plotting to you the height for age Z-scores. And on the right-hand panel, I'm plotting for you the stunting rates. On the x-axis is the proportion practicing untouchability by quintiles. What do you observe? You observe that the heights of the stunting rates for upper caste Hindu children are completely unaffected by the proportion practicing untouchability. It's kind of a flat line, and you can statistically test it, and there is no difference for them. On the other hand, you observe that, as you move into areas where untouchability is prevalent, the heights of the scheduled caste children drop drastically, and the stunting rates increase very sharply. Okay, so that's the kind of initial kind of a motivating evidence that I want to show you to suggest that seems to be a strong link. The areas where people practice untouchability are the same places where there's a sharp effect on the heights of children from the Dalit group or from the scheduled caste groups, but for the upper caste Hindu children, there seems to be no such pattern. Okay, and this is what we want to try and unpack in some sense. You can ask me something, Umbi, if you can't read the graph. I didn't realize it was so small on the screen,
No, but I think the explanation is quite clear here. Yeah, it was okay.
Okay, so now, of course, so now we want to try and think about, can we isolate the role of caste-based discrimination in some way, in terms of thinking about it, moving beyond these correlational patterns that I've showed you. And to do that, we kind of exploit history. So basically, when you think about the Indian history, historically, the geographical span of Hinduism was bounded to the south by the Vindhyas mountain range. Okay. So if you look at the work of Doniger, for instance, it defines Aryavarta as the country between the Himalayas and the Vindhyas mountain to the east of the disappearance and to the west of Pragya. And I'm going to show you a map right now. Similarly, if you look at one of the earliest texts which speaks about the caste system or talks about the Varna system, which is the correct word to use, it again highlights about, how the mountain ranges divide the land of the wise men from the barbarians in some sense, okay? And this is basically the map of the Aryavarta region drawn from the late Vedic period. And you can see this is the red line here, which is the Vindhyas mountain range, and which basically kind of, was a natural barrier which kind of separates what was the traditional span of Hinduism before, of course, Hinduism eventually is going to spread all across India and across parts of Southeast Asia also. Yeah. Okay, so that's the quirk of history we want to kind of exploit, and then I'm very eager to hear what people think about our interpretation and what kind of problems of inference that this kind of a strategy might possess. Yeah. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take the map of the Vindhyas mountain range. So I have a geographical map where I can. The National Family Health Survey, again, has geographical coordinates for all the households. So, I can pinpoint on the map on what are the latitudes and the longitudes. So basically, I'm going to be able to assign each household or an individual a location that if they're living to the north or the south of the Vindhyas range. And then I'm going to calculate for each of this respondent what is the distance from the Vindhyas. So what is the closest distance to the Vindhyas? And then I'm going to compare the upper caste Hindus and the SC children living to the north and the south of the Vindhyas, but in the same state. So, I'm going to always hold the state constant. I'm going to account for state fixed effects. And then I'm going to basically use a simple differences in differences estimator, where I'm basically going to think about what's the gap between upper caste Hindu children and the SC children just living to the north of the Vindhyas, and how does this gap compare to living to the south of the Vindhyas, and the difference of the two is going to provide me some kind of understanding about, what's happening here. You're going to see, so this is just how the raw data looks like, and again, observe an interesting pattern. So again, on the left-hand panel, this time it's flipped around. On the left-hand panel are the mean rates of stunting. On the right-hand panel are my height for 8Z scores. But what's interesting to observe, and you're going to see this when I show you the formally estimated results, moving across the north or the south of Vindhyas is going to have no implication for the heights or the stunting rates of the upper caste Hindu children. So there's nothing in generically special about living to the south of the Vindhyas, and I'm going to show you several exercises to try and convince you about this. And you're only going to observe that this difference creeps up for the SC children, that, they have much lower rates of stunting, as well as, or in other words, they have higher heights. Okay, so that's the pattern I'm going to try and want to explain to you. Okay, so that's how the raw data looks like, but I can, of course, put this into a very simple estimation framework, and this is what I'm going to basically estimate as my difference in differences estimator. So my dependent variable is a dummy for whether a child is stunted, I is stunted, residing in state S and in cluster C. Like I said, I'm always going to compare people living in the same state, but across the two sides of the mountain. So delta S is a state fixed effect. I'm going to flexibly control for the distance from Vindhyas using a second order polynomial. Of course, we are crossing a mountain range, so there are going to be changes in geographical conditions. Of course, I'm using a differences in differences estimator, but still, I can control for a variety of things at the cluster level. So I'm going to control for total population, annual precipitation, aridity, mean temperatures, wet day, growing length season, productivity of land, proximity to water, and proximity to national borders. Yeah. And at the individual level, for the child, I'm just going to control for age in months, the gender of the child, and urban or rural residence. As the data is collected at the level of the primary sampling units, that's the level at which I'm going to cluster the standard errors to account for any kind of spatial correlation that exists there. Yeah.
I have a question. So you're comparing so many districts, but so many things differ. For example, healthcare, then diseases, or even the weather.
So that's what I said, so the cluster level, are the primary sampling unit levels, and that's where I'm going to control for all the things that I can do where our geography varies, right? And I'm going to compare people living within the same state, right? So that's the level of control I can have. At the districts, I can't, there are differences across districts clearly, but I can't, the only way I can account for this is I'm going to show you that, if you look at the equation, that beta 2 is insignificant in the sense that living to the south of the Vindhyas has no benefit in general. The benefit only creeps up if you are an SC child. So you have to come up with an explanation. Why is that so? And there are some real explanations, and I'm going to try and rule them out, and then we can come back to this. But yeah, so that's the idea. It's the same state. So state level institutions are kind of held constant. I can control for local geography. And then again, I'm going to be interested in this difference in difference, and I'm going to show you living to the south in general has no effect. And then we need to think about why does it have an effect for SC children. But yeah, that's a valid point. I'm going to be comparing across districts within the same state. Some of them are within the district, but yeah, I'm not going to account for district fixed effects in my specification.
And why are you calling it a difference of difference?
Yeah.
There is no, I don't see the two differences in there.
With
Should be an RD.
So this is the difference I'm concerned in, right? Yeah. What is the difference in the north
versus the south?
Versus the south. So that's that's what the beta 3 in my equation is going to capture.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
what difference?
No, so this is the first difference it's going to calculate.
Okay. Okay, you mean
The
between
different, yeah, you know, what is the difference between the UC, between the caste across the north and the south? Exactly. So that's the difference I'm interested in. You know?
Sorry to keep you short.
No, no.
The shock, are you measuring a certain shock with this? Because I'm having trouble understanding like the shock that brings in from when you're using the, or is there more shock involved?
There's no shock. The dividing line is whether you are to the north or the south of the Vindhyas range. So it's not a shock. It's an historical incidence of the fact that, you know, the Hinduism was more prevalent in the north as compared to the south, and that's the break I'm using rather than exactly.
I have one question.
Question
So
from
in this,
yeah, please. Yeah, you have a question?
all right. Yeah, in this control variables, I don't see education like of matters. Isn't education important risk factor?
Yes, I mean, you can throw them in, it's not going to make much of a difference, but that's going to be a bad control, you know, it's going to be endogenous to, so I'm trying to only account for controls which are exogenous in the specification. So you see geography is given as well as age, gender, well, you could argue urban versus rural residents, whether it's endogenous or exogenous, but that's why I don't have controls which are again, themselves subject to caste-based discrimination. And I'm going to show you some evidence about when I come to the channels, and I'm going to highlight, you know, differences in mothers' well-being as being one of the channels as to why there are differences in stunting rates. But the reason that I don't account for it is I can, but it just would be a definition of a bad control in that sense.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so exactly. So like I said, you know, my coefficient of interest is beta 3, and beta 2 is basically telling us, you know, is there any kind of benefit in general living to the south of the Vindhyas? And so the first column, you know, I'm just sorry, please.
So what is your base category? So you have SC. So are you dumping all other social categories, or is it restricted to upper caste Hindus? Thank you.
Niaz, I'm just comparing upper caste Hindus versus the SCs here.
Okay.
In the paper, I do have, when I include all social groups, you know, but my motivation is to look at the role of caste-based discrimination, and that's why I'm primarily concentrating on the SCs here. So the column 1 is just basically showing you, just create, what's the raw gap, if you would estimate this, you know, it's 14 percentage points. On a mean, the upper caste Hindus have a stunting rate of 29%, if you can see here, and the SC kids are 14 percentage points more likely to be stunted, so 50% more higher stunting rates. In column 2, I'm just taking the sample which is within 100 kilometers of the north and south of Vindhyas, and there, of course, we are now really in this Bimaru belt, and you can see that the rates of stunting for the SC kids are even higher. On a base of 29% kids being stunted from the upper caste Hindu group, the SCs have a 21 percentage points greater likelihood of being stunted. Columns 3 and 4 are my more interesting specifications. And what do you observe here? That, you know, living to the south of the Vindhyas has basically no effect. In other words, you know, the upper caste Hindu children don't gain living to the north or the south of the Vindhyas. But the interaction term is large and statistically significant. So, you know, if you were to take the last column, for instance, you know, or take the 4th column maybe, which is including all my geographical controls and my state dummies and all the other ones that I specified to you, you can see that, you know, on an average, it reduces the gap by about a third. You know, so on a base of 23 percentage points, they're on an average more likely to be stunted. But once you move to the south, they have a reduction in their stunting rates by about 8 percentage points. Okay, so that's the key idea here. So basically, you can see that living to the south has no benefits. You can even do this not on the height on stunting, but you can just do it on where you need to truncate, but you could just use the height for age Z scores. And you again observe the similar pattern. No gains in heights for the people living to the south of the Indias, but only if you belong to the group of the scheduled caste children. Okay, so that's when you use this difference in differences estimator, that's the basic pattern that comes about. Okay. So now, of course, this interaction term being negative in terms of stunting rates, so showing that SC children are taller when they live to the south of the Vindhyas. Now you could ask, my interpretation is that this is as a result of the differences in caste-based discrimination. But you could try and argue, is there something systematically different about the south? What other factors could differ between the south and the north of the Vindhyas? Like I said, one thing you can see from these regressions is that heights of the upper caste children don't benefit from living to the south of the Vindhyas, So you could ask, is it socioeconomic status rather than caste, right? So is it just the case that, there is, once you live to the south of the Vindhyas, there's just some generic benefit to people who are socially, economically disadvantaged. The south has a bundle of policies which are addressed towards poorer groups, and there's nothing to do with caste. Right? So what do I do to address this concern? Is that in the National Family Health Survey, you have data on what quintile of the income distribution the individual belongs to, as well as a wealth index factor score. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two approaches. The first one a bit more block. I'm going to see whether an individual belongs to the bottom 60% of the wealth distribution and interact that with the Vindhyas, south of the Vindhyas term to see whether living into the south of the Vindhyas, the main effect is coming because of the fact that poor people benefit and SC children are poorer. And in a more flexible specification, I'm just going to interact the wealth index factor score with the living to the south of the Vindhyas to see whether, there's any benefit of being poor and living to the south of the Vindhyas. Okay? So let me just show you that before I discuss the second concern that I could try and address. And this is what I'm showing you in columns 1 and 2 here. Basic point to take away is, if you look at column 2, which is the more flexible one, you can see that the wealth index score interacted with the south of Vindhyas is extremely small and statistically significant. Not surprisingly, of course, the richer you are, the less likely you are to be stunted, but the socioeconomic status has no bearing on your anthropometric outcomes just because you're living to the south of the mountain range. Okay? So that's one way to rule out the fact that, it's not just generally pro-poor policies in the south of the Vindhyas that are relating to these benefits, because they don't occur to people who are just poor unless they belong to the SC group. Okay? The second factor that you could think about is that, is there a generic geographical gradient? As you move along the Vindhyas, it's maybe just something along, as you move south, things are getting better for people. So what do I do then? I say, well, my claim is what's important is crossing the mountain range. So the basic thought experiment I do is I take people who live to the north of the Vindhyas and compare people who are living 50 to 100 kilometers to the north compared to the people who are living 0 to 50 kilometers to the north. Similarly, I run this falsification test onto the south of the Vindhyas. I compare people who live 0 to 50 kilometers to the south compared to the ones who live 50 to 100 kilometers to the south. Again, if the interactions turn out to be insignificant, it will suggest, there's just not generic southern-north gradient. It only pops up when you actually cross the mountain range. Okay? And that's what columns 3 and 4 are showing you here. You can see that the interaction between, wow, I forgot the term. Yeah, this is the interaction terms between 50 kilometers of the north of Vindhyas or 50 kilometers to the south of Vindhyas interacted with the south of Vindhyas are, it said the battery is running low, are insignificant. So again, so the two explanations I can kind of rule out from the data are that, the effect I'm capturing is not a generic benefit of pro-poor policies, or that there's no geographical gradient in general that's leading to it.
Rajesh, can I ask a question about the state itself? Because you are doing a comparison, basically creating a hypothetical mountain range within 50 kilometers and 100 kilometers away from the range itself. But I'm just wondering how big the state is, like, because you're doing it within the state.
Yeah,
So are you
states
not
are.
capturing it just because they might have crossed the border already for the 50 to 100 meters?
They are all within, they're all contingent on state fixed effects. I'm always comparing only individuals living, and these states are very big volume.
Okay, I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So I can show, you can look at a map of India, and they're crossing through states, which are, Madhya Pradesh and Bihar and the northern parts of Uttar Pradesh. So none of them are driven by the fact that I'm crossing state boundaries.
All right.
Yeah.
Was this conducted at the state? Like, what level was it conducted at? Like, what is the most minute level the government has?
This one.
Yeah.
These are all at the household level surveys. Yeah. That's why I'm running the regressions at the level of a child, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just for my knowledge, regarding India, so for example, you have like states and then you probably have cities. And what is the lowest administrative boundary in India? You know?
A block.
A block.
Yeah. It's a group of villages, is a block. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you would have block officers then, And of course, at the village level also, you have village panchayats.
Also sort of a village officer.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. A group of villages is called a block. Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'll show you the results. So, but maybe I can take this time to then walk you through the last exercise that I do here. So, one of the interpretations that I give to this gap is that there is discrimination in the provision of kind of key services to mother and children. And so basically again uses difference in differences estimator again, but now first compare mothers who are living across the north and the south, and again see, what are the differences in terms of access to prenatal care, postnatal care, human capital outcomes as measured by education, and whether the women are of short stature. Basically, if you're less than 145 centimeters in height, you're classified as being in short stature, and this has implications for, your child's health also. And again, so it's back now, I can show you that, you're going to see, you again find the similar patterns across the north and the south, so that SC women who are just living to the south of the Vindhyas, are going to be doing systematically better. So let me just show you that here. So like I said, again, on an average, the SC people always do worse. So, they're 19 percentage points more likely not to have any prenatal care, 18 percentage points more likely to have home delivery, 11 percentage points more likely to be of short stature, and have 4.5 years less of education. But once you live to the south of the Vindhyas, you again benefit at being an SC mother. You cut the gap in education by about a third. You are less likely to have a home delivery, as well as you are less likely to be of short stature. Okay. The final thing that I do is, like I said, the evidence also suggests that, these have implications for provision of public services such as vaccinations for children. Again, in the NFHS, I have detailed information on the schedule of all the important vaccinations that children are supposed to get. And again, I use this difference in differences estimator to try and understand, are there systematic differences across the north and the south of the Vindhyas? Again, you observe that, the SC children on an average are less likely to be vaccinated either with the BCG vaccine, the DPT vaccine, the polio, or the measles vaccine. But for 3 of the 4 ones living to the south of the Vindhyas, again increases their vaccination rates such that it almost closes the gap between the upper caste Hindus and the SC children. So with that, I think I will just conclude here. The basic idea was to show that, this focus on India, South Africa has come, Sub-Saharan Africa has come at the expense of ignoring within inequities in India, which are 2 to 3 times larger than the Indian Sub-Saharan Africa gap. We show that the highest rates and gaps are concentrated in this region of India, which is called being traditionally the most socioeconomically disadvantaged. We show that SC but not upper caste Hindu children heights are correlated with the practice of untouchability. And like I said, to try and convince you that caste discrimination has something to do with it, I exploit the fact that, historically, the span of Hinduism was bounded to the south by the Vindhyas mountain range. And I show you that living to the south of the Vindhyas reduces stunting gaps by around half. And then finally provide evidence consistent with the channels hypothesized that there seems to be poorer service delivery and outcomes for SC mothers, as well as vaccination rates for SC children. So thank you so much, and happy to take questions.
No, it's a great exercise. Thank you very much for presenting this very clearly. I just have one problem. It's not a question, but something that you can highlight in the narrative is that the discrimination seems to be more intense in more geographically or population dense areas. This seems to have a bit of a aggregate impact as well. So this is just a comment that it seems to be worse where there's more people, where there's more resources apparently. And I don't know much in India, but in the upper north of India, I don't know if that's more prosperous as well. If that's the case, then it matters even more where there's more prosperity, there's more discrimination as well, so it has bigger negative aggregate impact. If that's the case.
Yeah, so the first part is true. These are the most populous parts of the country. These are the northern plains, you know, so typically the Gangetic plains, which are kind of very fertile. But they're certainly not the most prosperous parts of the country. You know, there's a huge north-south divide where the south does generally better on a variety of indicators that we would care about. So, in fact, if you look at Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, you know, and compare them on human development to some of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, on a variety of human development indicators, they look worse. But one important reason that they look worse is that the socially disadvantaged groups, there's a huge drop in their well-being in these states as compared to in the southern states. But yeah.
The Chicago school, Gary Becker, have always argued that if business has to be more competitive, etc. So have you looked at any effect of, say, the share of exports in the state? I mean, Hyderabad and Bangalore are both to the south, of course, of this mountain range.
No.
And there must be more exports there as a share of GDP, so more competitiveness in business. Have you been able to look at that?
No, that's an interesting point. What I could try and think more about what are some of the moderating factors and whether I can explore heterogeneity along these lines. I've looked at only the urban-rural divide, and you do observe larger gaps in rural areas as compared to urban areas. But I haven't explored systematically what are the features, like you said, you know, Becker would argue would moderate the taste for discrimination because people have a higher cost in discriminating.
Exports.
Yeah, I guess I could put together state level or district level export rates and interact with them and be able to see whether, you know, these are the areas where people tend to discriminate less because there is larger gains to cooperation in some sense. Yeah. Thank you.
So Raj, I have a hard time wrapping my head around accessibility in terms of the northern region and the southern region. In terms of like, do the northern region have more access or they don't have access? And then
in access to
like hospitals, the mechanisms that you talk about.
So you can see for the upper caste Hindus on almost all the indicators, there is no difference whether you just live to the north or the south. Because you're looking within the same state always, you know, these are institutional features at a state that are being driven by at the state level. So there are no differences living to the north or the south as long as you belong to the socially dominant group.
Right, but I'm just wondering if the upper caste in the northern region have more access in terms of wealth to travel to get the help that they actually need, and it's actually wealth driven again.
So you mean to say the people in the north are kind of ascribing to private care, whereas in the upper caste, the SC people cannot,
right.
And in the southern part, both groups have better access to public facilities.
Exactly.
It's possible, but like I said, you know, then it has to be, like was being pointed out, there has to be systematic differences at a much local, at a local level, because like I said, my comparison is always within the same state, but it should happen then, like for your argument, that the districts which lie within the same state, but to the south of the Vindhyas, have systematically better provision of services than districts that lie to the north of the Vindhyas. And there are some things I could look at it in the data a bit more. But yeah, my own primary.
Because that is the worry, right? That the southern states are systematically better because you show that.
But it's not the southern states, that's what I'm again and again stressing.
Southern region within the state.
Within the state. Exactly. Yeah. So
Sorry,
So that's a good point, and so that's a good channel that you ascribe, that the people in the north are able to access privately provided services, and that's why there's no gap between them for the north and the south. Whereas in the south, these people are not able to, and the upper and the lower caste people don't do so in the north, but in the south there's public provision. But like I said, the only thing I can do is I can calculate a range of things from other data sources to explore whether there are systematic within state but district differences across the north and the south. I can't tell you right now, but that's a plausible story. I agree,
Rajesh, you mentioned about the affirmative action policy for the SC group.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to have much of an impact yet. Policies in favor of the SC.
So like I said, the main domain of policy, let's say at an individual level, one is access to higher education. So once you finish school, seats in public universities are equivalent to the share in the population is reserved for them. Similarly, in government jobs. But like I was already mentioning, this is when you have already, so to get even the lowest ranking government job, you need to have finished 10 years of schooling, right? So at some level, the affirmative action kicks in at a very late stage. If you never manage to finish school, you're clearly not going to go to university and benefit from the affirmative action. Yeah. And similarly, you can think about, unless you finish 10 years of schooling, you're not going to be benefiting from access to government jobs. There is evidence, even one of my own papers, which shows it has benefited the SC groups, but clearly not in any way that the gaps have closed. If you look from independence to today, on a variety of indicators, gaps have opened up. So but the conclusion generally in the literature is if they hadn't been there, the gaps would have been even larger without affirmative action. But it has clearly not been successful in eradicating gaps in any ways. Yeah.
But just to clarify, you picked one state and you looked at the 50-kilometer north and south.
No, I take all the states which are within 100 kilometers of the north or the south of India. There are 8 states which are included there.
Gujarat, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Gujarat, MP.
That's sort of a belt above and below.
Exactly. And just
50-kilometer radius up and down.
Yeah.
Maybe real quick, we can ask if anyone who is connected remotely, if anyone has a question, because I think it's a little bit difficult to chime in from there while we are talking here. So anyone?
Rajesh, again, fascinating. Just a quick clarification questions. If you were to repeat the analysis, instead of focusing on scheduled caste children to replace that dummy with lower caste Muslims, what do you find? Because there is the Sacha Commission report in 2006, and there is this growing concern over religious marginalization in India. So my question is that, well, the southern regions are attractive not just for scheduled caste, but also for other marginalized, social groups. And stunting is also a problem for, if I'm not mistaken, lower caste Muslims, where it's not about untouchability, rather it's about religious hatred and so on. So because your focus is on untouchability, so I just want to be clear that it is driving the result and nothing else, not the rather broader pattern of social polarization. Thank you.
No, Neil, that's a very good point, and we do exactly the same exercise that you're suggesting in the paper. We compare the gap between upper caste Hindus and replace the SC first with upper caste Muslims and show there are no systematic benefits for upper caste Muslims to live to the south of the Vindhyas. But when you look at lower caste Muslims, so Muslims who self-report as being Dalits, you find exactly the same pattern. The sample sizes are small, so they're not so precisely estimated, but they are still statistically significant at conventional levels. And that kind of is another argument we make in the paper to say, look, Muslims on an average are very disadvantaged in India today, but if untouchability is the story, then you should not observe these differences for upper caste Muslims, but for lower caste Muslims, and we find exactly the same pattern there.
Wait, there are castes within Muslims?
Yes, there are castes within Muslims. In a sense, Islam is claims to be caste free, but there are two waves of conversions in India. People who converted because of aligning themselves with the powers to be at the time and were the socio-economically well off. And then there are groups which converted because they were the most ostracized under the Hindu system. So there is a large number of Muslims who self-report today, even today, so they are asked, what caste you belong to, they are Dalits, So even in the context of, you can think about Pakistan, let's say, there's been a lot of talk about, let's say, the sweeper class, which comes from the former untouchables who converted to Islam, but are still ostracized even today, So
there are Muslims who were upper caste.
They're upper caste in the sense that they were not lower caste Hindus who converted to Islam. They were upper caste Hindus who converted to Islam.
So I would a little disagree with that, but what you're thinking of in terms of religion, I don't think that's the case, but we can talk about later. I think this is remnants of previous castes within Hindus. So when Dalits convert to Muslims, they are still treated as Dalit or lower class.
That's what I exactly mean.
But then, for example, in Pakistan, there is these caste differences, but it's not within Muslims. So there is, I think, across religions, there's a lot of discrimination. But I won't call it upper caste or lower caste.
I can show you several articles from the Economic and Political Weekly, which have carried out studies in the context of Pakistan.
It's more of the main difference. It's not within religion, across religion, more in Pakistan, and within religion, I guess, in India. That's more.
I think Rajesh is similar in Bangladesh as well, and the government maintains it because there is a mindset that if you allow a certain, what you're calling as Dalits, to move from their income levels, then who's going to do the dirty work? So it's actually not within religion, but it's actually historically done. Even in India, I think it's similar. Historically, they are kept.
But they do self-report as being Muslims also, right?
They are Muslims, for sure.
That's what I meant. I don't say whether the religious code prescribes it or not, but that is the living artifact of how the life is lived. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Yeah.
When we have
Good. Any other questions?
So I'm thinking these are all the Indian government publish, these data are from the published documents, and then do you find difficulties in getting on that?
These are publicly available. You can log on to the Demographic and Health Survey website. They're all at a household level. So every household member's data is available to you as a separate line. So you can just register and say, why you want the data, and in a couple of days you will get a username and password, and these are available for more than 75 countries with a large number of rounds of data too. Yeah, you can in fact, like I said, locate them for recent rounds. You can geographically locate them on the world map within a distance of 5 kilometers where they live.
Good. Any more questions?
Of course, I may be misunderstanding. So you used a different method here, and how do you justify the parallel trend assumption considering that you live north and south of the mountain range? What is your justification that it's the same before and after? I mean,
there's no before and after here, right? because so the only thing that I can say here is that, so like I said, that's that's the interpretation about, one, to show that the group, which is the baseline group here, the upper caste Hindus, there's no benefit for them living to the south of the Vindhyas. Okay, so there's no generic so that's one argument to say. And then, like I said, you can think about what are the other reasons, So because this is kind of like a definitive which uses a historical event, there is no pre-post basically here, right? The pre-post is replaced by north-south in some sense.
Just where people chose to settle, sort of, in that sense.
Or I would say where the mountain range ran, that's what is my kind of a shock. The mountain range placement is not endogenous, basically. Of course, you could ask, did systematic sorting take place across the mountain range? I can't answer that question. No. Kunbi, you had a question?
Yeah. What a question? You had one? Then I think Adam, do you have a question?
I have a quick question. I saw when you were measuring the mean of stunting growth, you used the benchmark from WHO, is that correct?
Yes.
And it takes the mean of all children around the world, the height, is that correct?
It takes 6 reference populations.
I was wondering if is that the gold standard to measure stunting, or is there other that you could consider?
That is the global standard for measuring stunting. There are authors like Panagiria who have argued, that this is a wrong measure for a country like India, and that's why it's such high rates of stunting, and that genetics has an important role to play. But this has been faced a very big pushback from the medical and the economics literature, which has argued that that's a cheap way to counter poor outcomes in your country. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank Rajesh for a great talk. I think this was a very good kickoff. And then, Agustin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, good. Can you quickly give us the next event in the series? Is that already fixed?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks a lot, Rajesh. Sorry I'm not there. I'm still a little bit sick. But it was amazing. Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for coming to Sasana Kijan. So the next event will be in October 4th, which is 2 weeks from now. And it will be a talk on gender impact of COVID-19 in the Philippine labor market. So this one will be from someone from the World Bank that is based in Philippines. So I guess this time will be completely online. And then in 1 month, in October 18, we have Pauline Ko from Monash University, which I guess is around. And then that one will be again like Sasana Kiyan. So hopefully everyone who is already there, hopefully can make it in 1 month again, and let's try to keep like doing this because I think that having again in-person seminars is completely different from the online one. So hopefully we can have as many people as we have this time. And thanks a lot for coming.
If they also have that. If they have the same page, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Agustin. So to close things up, first of all, please take out your cell phones, even if you're present or if you're online, and go to that link and please leave us a very quick feedback on your experience today. It will literally take 10 seconds. And then I would again like to thank Rajesh and a token of all appreciation.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, and then I very much hope to see all of you in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, so like next, in 2 weeks' time, we have it online, and then in a month's time, then again, we have it offline. Sounds good. Yeah, and maybe this week, actually next Saturday, I'm in Germany for 10 days. But when I'm back, maybe we should, I had a couple of small ideas. Maybe you might be interested in the context of Malaysia. We can talk about it. It would require some data collection, but on a very small scale, which will be done very effectively, I think. Based on my perspective, an interesting question on education, and maybe we travel here and we can have a chat to see whether it's something that interests you.
Sounds good.
Okay.
So where will you go, Frankfurt?
To Siegen. That's where my wife's family lives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, your wife is German.
My wife's German. No. So it's my sister's getting married, so it's unexpected. I mean, she's has 2 children and all, but it's undecided that they would like to get married also. So
fun.
Yeah, I was so keen on flying out. But next week we have a semester break, so that's not so bad. You've been traveling a lot now?
No, I haven't been traveling very much. I've been away like